Okay. Well, we want to welcome all of you to this very special time with Rabbi Mark Kinser. And what's so thrilling is we have people from all over the United States here. I just met someone who moved here a month ago from Washington State. Well, he didn't come a month ago to go to our seminar. He went to enroll in college, but we'll take it. You know what I mean? And we have people from the Washington, D.C. area, from the Carolinas, just from all over. So it's great that you're all here. I have some announcements I'd like to make to begin. And so, first of all, if you have not registered yet, please see Shana. Where is Shana? Is she? There's Shana right there. So sometime this evening, if you haven't had an opportunity to register, be sure to see her. Now, next, no food or drink in the sanctuary, except water, of course. Feel free to bring water in. That's no problem. Next, photography is fine except on Shabbat. Okay? On Shabbat, no photography, but other times, feel free. You want to take a picture with Mark Kinser for your grandchildren. Do that by all means. Okay. I'm going to introduce Shana in just a couple of minutes to share about the schedule, but in the meantime, I want to mention one very special thing, and that's Shabbat morning, we are going to be led by a team which I have affectionately called the Two Nathans and Company. Okay? So we'll have Rabbi Nathan Joyner and Nathan Morell, our UMJC intern, and they and others in our leadership will be leading an a cappella service. We have multiple music groups in the synagogue here, but on a rotation, we have a cappella services, and we think you'll enjoy the service very much. Next, Saturday night, we have some things to say about a meal that we'll have, but I'm going to hold off on that announcement until tomorrow. And we want to say a special thank you right now to Ralph Zazula. Where's Ralph? Ralph is right back there. He has orchestrated all of the sound, but also our live streaming. We're on YouTube, we're streaming live, and we'll make the tapes available, or the recordings available as well for folks who can't be with us. But aside from all of you who are here tonight, we have many people from around the country, and who knows, maybe further, who are able to participate by participating in the live streaming. The only other announcement I have before I invite Shana up to tell us a little more about the schedule is that Mark has written a number of books. He has a limited number of copies of those books that will be available in the foyer after the meeting tonight. But if they're all gone, not to worry, you can get all of them on Amazon.com. So, Shana, may I ask you to come up and share a little bit about our schedule? Let's welcome Shana, who has done such an amazing job in this conference. She has really put this together so beautifully.
Thank you, Rabbi Rich.
Pleasure.
Just a few words about the schedule. Thank you all for being on time. We'll probably go until somewhere between 8:30 and 9 o'clock tonight. And then tomorrow we start at 9:30 a.m. for another hour and a half to 2 hour session. Then we'll break for lunch, and then we have an afternoon session at 2 o'clock. And then we have Shabbat dinner together at 6 o'clock. It's catered, it's kosher, it'll be really fun. We're going to do a little bit of Kabbalat Shabbat, led by Nathan, our rabbinic intern. And then we'll be back here on Shabbat morning for services at 10:30, and then an afternoon session. And then also we'll talk about dinner on Saturday night as well. If you have any questions at all, especially about registration, feel free to come to me, find me somewhere, and I'll hopefully be able to answer your question. But that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. And I just have one other very important announcement, and that is we're going to ask you to be aware of the space between the camera and the podium, and we're going to ask you if you need to move around or leave the sanctuary for any reason, please do not get in this space here. That's very, very important. Okay, I am going to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Rabbi Mark Kinser. Rabbi Dr. Mark Kinser is the spiritual leader of Congregation Zera Avraham in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he is the president emeritus of the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, MJTI. He's also the co-chair of the Helsinki Consultation on Jewish Continuity in the Body of Messiah, an initiative that aims to build relationships between Messianic Jews and Jewish people in the churches. Mark is a leading theologian in the Messianic Jewish movement and the author of Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism in 2005, Israel's Messiah and the People of God, 2011, and Searching Her Own Mystery, 2015. His latest volume will appear in 2018 and deals with the relationship between the Besorah, that is the good news of the risen Messiah, and the rebirth of a Jewish nation in its ancestral land. We'll look forward to that book coming out. Meanwhile, let's welcome Rabbi Mark to speak to us tonight. Come on up here, Mark.
Thank you, Rich. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all, and also with any others who may be participating online, wherever you may be. The title of this 5-part series is A New Vision for a New Generation. Perhaps another title for this that really wouldn't have been as good, I think, in advertising would be, What has Mark Kinser been thinking about recently? Now, in terms of honesty in advertising, a new vision. Well, I'm not really going to be also presenting a new vision. In advertising, you need to puff things up a little bit. But let's just say I hope to present an updated or nuanced vision. And I think this is necessary because of the changes that we have experienced over these recent years, both in the Jewish world and the Christian world, and just in the world in general. But it's also crucial because we're at a unique juncture right now in the history of the Messianic Jewish movement. And that leads to the second part of the title, A New Generation. When it comes to this term, there's really no puffery involved. It's quite literal. We are right now in the process of a dramatic transition in the life of the Messianic Jewish movement. Like all transitions that take a decade or two, it's possible to not even notice that it's happening. But I can assure you it is happening. The transition I speak of is one of a generation of leaders passing on the reins of leadership to the movement to another generation of leaders. Sometimes we do it reluctantly, but eventually, even baby boomers need to pass on authority. In order to make this clear, I sent out a number of emails to many of my friends who are leaders in the Messianic Jewish movement. Leaders of missions, leaders in the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, leaders in the Messianic Jewish Alliance, a variety of people. And I also did just a little bit of hunting on the web, and I figured out the ages of a lot of people. And I just wanted to give you a list of major leaders. And this is a fairly representative list. I could actually double it or triple it. and the result would be the same. First of all, we have our founding group of leaders, those who were already quite mature when the Messianic Jewish movement was born in the 1970s. Most of them have already passed on to the next life. I'm thinking of Moshe Rosen, Marty Chernoff, Manny Brotman, Art Katz, Louis Goldberg, Rachmiel Friedman, my own mentor, Haskell Stone. Now, some of you who have not been deeply immersed in the Messianic movement might not even know these names, but these were the founders of our movement. At the same time in the 1970s, there was a generation of young people who were influenced by these founders, who in the 1970s were in their 20s, occasionally in their early 30s, and emerged as major leaders at a very, very early stage. These are the people that we now really look to as the venerable figures in the Messianic Jewish movement. I want to give you the list, and I'm going to tell you their age, and I want you to imagine 10 years down the road. And don't just hear this age, add 10 years or add 15 years, and imagine where they will be at in, say, the year 2030. David Stern, many ways, part of that original generation, 82. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, 74. Stuart Dauerman, 73. Elliot Clayman, 72. John Fisher, 71. Dan Juster, 70. Russ Resnick, 69. Joel Chernoff, 67. Michael Wolff, 67. Sue Perlman, 67. Rachel Wolff, 66. David Chernoff, 66. Mark Kinser, 65. Mitch Glazer, 65. Rich Nickel, 65. Michael Schiffman, now we're getting to the kids. Michael Schiffman, 62. Michael Brown, 62. Richard Harvey, 61. And then the real kids, David Brickner, 59, and Jonathan Bernis, 57. Now, this is an impressive list of people, but when you put them all together and you project ahead 10 to 15 years, we're all going to be, maybe not in nursing homes, but, we're not going to be the major figures aggressively leading conferences and leading the charge of the Messianic Jewish movement. At that time, you'll go to a conference, and none of these people will be the people up on stage unless they're receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. And so we have a transition going on right now. And at times of transition like this, it's very important to reflect on where we've been and where we are going and how the circumstances around us have changed. It's a little bit like in those times in the Torah when either one generation of leaders or matriarchal figures are passing on, and they give blessings that are prophetic in nature to the generation that is to come after them. Well, I think it's very important at this stage of things for my colleagues and I myself to be thinking in these terms, to be thinking about what is it that we have to say to those who are coming after us. And I'm not intending to leave the stage in a dramatic way in the next couple of years. But I see in many ways the remaining years that I have of active work as a time of my the final set of things that I'm going to pass on. And so that's the sort of message I'm going to be giving in these 5 sessions, in presenting a new vision for a new generation. What I want to do this evening is to situate this vision in the context of the history of the Messianic Jewish movement. Then, in the next 3 sessions, I want to focus on this changing landscape around us. So, session 2 will focus on the changing Jewish landscape. Session 3 on the changing Christian landscape. Session 4 on the changing secular landscape. And then the final session, we'll try to wrap all of this up and talk about the future of Messianic Judaism. I'll be commenting on that future as we're going along, but I hope to bring it all together in that final session. And in this first session, in talking about the history, I'm going to be particularly focusing on something called Bilateral Ecclesiology. And I'm going to be talking about that also throughout these 5 sessions. Because in many ways, what I'm wanting to do over these next 5 sessions is an update or a nuancing of our understanding of bilateral ecclesiology. Now, before I'm going to come back and explain what that fancy term means in just a bit. But first, I want to talk about the birth of Messianic Judaism. In the 1970s, my baby boomer colleagues and I, who had all come to faith in Yeshua in that decade or in the late 1960s, began to rethink our Jewish identity and its relationship to our faith in Yeshua. This was, of course, in the wake of a new resurgence of Jewish pride following the Six-Day War 50 years ago, and a reassertion of ethnic identities in general in America that was taking place in the 1960s. It was also part of the entire milieu of the time, the counterculture, the pushing back against institutions as they existed, questioning, challenging, and not presuming that the way things were is the way things needed to be. The Jewish Christians of the 1950s and the 1960s had formerly made a rather neat distinction between natural birth and spiritual birth. Jewish identity was a matter of natural birth, genealogy, ethnicity, our culture, but that which we were born into. And being Christian, our faith was a result of our spiritual birth, the birth by the Holy Spirit into the kingdom of God. And so spiritual experience, religious doctrine, and practice fundamentally are shaped by traditional Christian patterns, but it was important to also be part of the Jewish people because that was our people by birth. The Messianic Jewish movement, as it emerged in the 1970s, challenged this neat distinction between natural birth and spiritual birth. And it was wondering if Yeshua was really a Jew and the work that he was accomplishing was fundamentally in continuity with what God's purposes were for the Jewish people, then the new spiritual birth had to be just as Jewish as Yeshua's own physical birth was, and as our own physical birth was. Now, this discovery, this insight, was translated in many different ways among us. And those differences remain in the Messianic Jewish movement today. There are some universals, and then there are many distinctives. For all of us, I would say, one of the things I could say, there's not a lot of things that are true for everyone who claims to be a Messianic Jew. But at least for nearly all of us, this meant reclaiming the Jewish calendar as our calendar. It didn't mean being hostile to a Christian calendar, religious calendar, but it did mean beginning to shape our lives more around the rhythm, the fundamental rhythm of traditional Jewish life that's rooted in the text of the Torah itself. And this was true even for Messianic Jews who were not willing to acknowledge the Torah as a whole as the fundamental constitution of Jewish life. But it was true of virtually the entire movement that we could call the Messianic Jewish movement, and that was different from the Jewish Christian movement of the 1950s and 60s. In addition to that, for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, this also meant rediscovering the Torah as that enduring foundation of Jewish life. That Yeshua was realizing, that he was fulfilling, but that he was not dismissing or undermining. And then for some of us, this meant even finding new meaning in the teachings and practices of the rabbinic tradition. So, for all Messianic Jews, the religious calendar of Judaism, for many, the Torah, and for some, rabbinic tradition as well. Messianic Jewish congregations emerged, and in the Messianic Jewish congregations, we tried to reshape Jewish life in Yeshua according to these patterns. And so for some of the congregations, it was mainly the calendar that was the central thing, and that was the only distinctive Jewish thing, but it was significant in itself. For others, it was biblical Judaism, the Torah, as a written text, but not rabbinic tradition. And then for others among us, in varying degrees, there was also drawing upon the rabbinic tradition. Now, most of the leaders of the Messianic Jewish movement, the list of people that I read to you at the beginning, who 10 to 15 years from now will be octogenarians, the vast majority of us, and maybe everyone on that list, were thoroughly enculturated Jews. We had two Jewish parents. We grew up in Jewish neighborhoods by and large, around Jewish people. Now, we were Jewishly enculturated, but we were not by and large religiously erudite. And that's an important distinction. It meant that when we entered into leadership of a congregation, we could bring some authentic Yiddishkeit. But we really didn't have a great deal of expertise in knowing how a synagogue was run, or how a traditional liturgical service was to be led, or about the classic texts of the Jewish tradition and the way in which Jews through the centuries have studied them and taught them. And therefore, our religious experimentation tended, let's be frank, it tended to be amateurish and somewhat superficial. And our ways of thinking and acting were still in that period largely determined by evangelical patterns we had absorbed from our Christian mentors and friends. It really couldn't have probably been any other way. That is who we were. But there was a desire, by and large, to learn and to grow. Now, from the very beginning, there were dedicated non-Jews who were connected with these congregations and the Messianic Jewish movement. The Messianic Jewish movement has never been a movement that simply had Jews. There were always non-Jews involved. But it was generally intuitively sensed, I think, that the role of these non-Jews was a supportive role, that they were there to cheer us on as Messianic Jews, to help us, to do whatever needed to be done, to help us move forward and do what needed to be done. In this period, there was no clear definition of their role in relationship to the role of the Jews. It was vague, it was unclear. The one thing that was clear, I would say, was that sense of the supportive role. But even that was not so much explicitly articulated. It was assumed. And so we really never worked out a lot of the tough issues in those days. Should those non-Jews be wearing a talit? Should they read from the Torah? Should they have a bar or a bat mitzvah? Should they be ordained to the rabbinate? These were questions that just weren't processed in any deep way. Now, when I founded a Messianic Jewish congregation in the early 1990s. It was a group of people who had been together actually from the early 1980s. But we actually organized as a congregation for the first time in the early 1990s. And I still remember our first set of bylaws and how we articulated the purpose of our Messianic Jewish congregation, and particularly on this issue of Jews and Gentiles. Because we had non-Jews involved with us, just like every other Messianic Jewish congregation did. And the way we articulated it, I think, resembles something about the way many others in the Messianic Jewish movement thought about it. We said that we were a sign of Jewish and Gentile reconciliation in the body of Messiah. We were a sign of reconciliation between Jew and Gentile in the body of Messiah. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. We all believe from the Bisarah, from particularly the writings of Paul, particularly from a text like Ephesians, we see how central this notion of Jewish-Gentile reconciliation is in the body of Messiah. But is a Messianic Jewish congregation in itself supposed to be a sign of Jewish and Gentile reconciliation? And that question was one that led me to rethink some very basic things about our own life in our congregation in Ann Arbor. And eventually led a number of us to rethink Messianic Judaism. And this leads us to the emergence of Hashivenu and this fancy term, Bilateral Ecclesiology. So I want to now set within the history of Messianic Judaism, Hashivenu and Bilateral Ecclesiology. Hashivenu was founded in 1997, 20 years ago, as a kind of incubator for new vision in the Messianic Jewish movement. The founders, the original founder was Rabbi Stuart Dowerman, and Rabbi Stuart had gathered Michael Schiffman, Paul Saul, Bob Chenoweth, and myself. And over a year period, we formulated the Hashivenu core values. And I'm not going to read the core values to you. Most of you are familiar with them. If you would like to see them, you could probably go to the Hashivenu website. But at the heart of the Hashivenu core values is the sense that we as Messianic Jews needed to connect more deeply and authentically with the Jewish people and tradition. It was a sense of discomfort with what I described earlier as the somewhat superficial nature of our Jewish practice and life in the Messianic Jewish movement. And it was a growing dissatisfaction with the way in which our spiritual life seemed to simply reflect the evangelical world around us. Now, none of us were hostile to evangelicalism. We all actually had a great deal of respect and appreciation for the gifts we had received from it, and saw it as a very valuable tradition that all believers in Yeshua could learn from. But we didn't think that Messianic Judaism was simply supposed to be a slightly Judaized version of evangelicalism. And that was our concern, because that's what we thought it was becoming. The first Hashivenu Forum was held in 1999, and in fact, its main theme turned out to be, it wasn't officially this, but the motif which was I saw running throughout the conference was this question of Judaism and evangelicalism, and how we had to rethink our relationship to the evangelical world. In the year 2000, Hashivenu published a booklet that I wrote that was called The Nature of Messianic Judaism. And it was in that booklet that I proposed what came to be known as Bilateral Ecclesiology. I think you can understand bilateral ecclesiology perhaps best from my own experience if you think about what I told you was in our own bylaws of my congregation. And that question that I had, is the Messianic Jewish congregation, an individual congregation, itself supposed to be the place in which we have a fundamental sign of reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles? And I came to see that there was something very, very problematic about that. And the reason I saw that there was something problematic about it is I saw that we could go in one of two directions. In one direction, we would be asking the Gentiles in the congregation to basically simply live as Jews. Take on a Jewish life. Give up celebrating Christmas. Give up, celebrating Easter. Give up worshiping on Sunday as a special day. And come and take on our distinctive Jewish life. If we did that, then my question is, do we really have Gentiles in our congregation that are truly Gentiles who are manifesting together with us this reconciliation. All we're doing is saying, okay, we can be reconciled with you if you come and be Jews de facto. You know, as long as Gentiles in effect become Jews, then we're reconciled with them. As long as they stay really Gentiles and Christians, then we're not really reconciled. And that just seemed to me very problematic. It also, in effect, is saying that there's something fundamentally second class about being a Gentile. That the only way you can be reconciled with us is if, in effect, you come and just live the way we do as Jews. Of course, the other approach we could take is simply have our congregations follow much more evangelical type of patterns and basically be something more like a Jewish Christian church, in which what we're doing is simply having the Jews become Gentiles instead of having the Gentiles become Jews. And of course, that's not satisfactory either. You only have reconciliation, the potential for reconciliation between two parties, if you have two parties. If you have two realities that are different, that remain different, and yet find a way to love one another in the midst of their difference. I came to believe that we couldn't do that within one congregation. That a congregation either had to have a Jewish way of life or it had to have a Christian way of life. They were both good, but you couldn't have both in the same congregation. You could only have one calendar to shape the rhythms of your life. And that's just an illustration, but it's a very basic one because it was that which was universal to the Messianic Jewish movement. And so, what bilateral ecclesiology said is that the people of God, the body of Messiah, is inherently twofold. It is Jewish and it is multinational. It is a reality that is made up of those from the nations. And the Jewish reality had to be a corporate reality that was truly shaped according to Jewish principles. And in that multinational reality of the church, we couldn't demand that they follow all of those Jewish principles, that we should expect that the wealth of culture that emerged among these different peoples over the generations was something that God would shape and work with and bring something beautiful out of. And so the sign then of unity had to be the relationship between these two corporate realities. That we had to find a way together. And bilateral ecclesiology, at first people said, well, this is talking about two separate churches, two separate ecclesiae. Ecclesia is the Greek word for congregation or church, or synagogue, really. And so when people heard this notion of a bilateral ecclesiology, they thought it means these two separate realities. But that's not what we were talking about. We're not talking about two separate realities. We're talking about two distinct realities. And there's a difference between two things that are distinct and two things that are separate. Two things that are separate, one is over here and one is over here, and they might wave at one another, but they're not together. But you can have two hands that fold together in unity, and yet you still have a right hand and you still have a left hand. They're distinct. They remain distinct, even as they are joined together. And that's what bilateral ecclesiology is talking about. Now, according to this vision, there's still going to be non-Jews in Messianic Jewish congregations. And to be frank, there's still going to be a lot of Jews in Christian churches. This is not a kind of absolutist kind of system that's saying, okay, now we're going to orchestrate this. Will all of you Gentiles please cross over on that line? Well, all of you Jews please cross over onto this side, and as if it's like this segregated reality. You know, that's not the way it is, and that's not the way it will ever be. What bilateral ecclesiology is talking about the shaping of communities and community environments, and saying that if we are to have a Jewish expression of faith in Yeshua, we need to have Jewish environments that are shaped by Jews in Jewish ways. But also, if we are to have a church which is truly a church of the nations, it needs to have freedom to develop. And it shouldn't be restricted according to all of the patterns that are found within the Jewish community. Now, what I think you can probably see here is that bilateral ecclesiology is a vision that's built on two core convictions. One, the body of Messiah needs an authentic Jewish expression. And two, the body of Messiah also needs to be a place where the nations of the world can come to know the God of Israel and bring their purified cultural riches as offerings to God through the Messiah. Bilateral ecclesiology is about both of those, not just one. It's not just about let us Jews really be Jews. It's also about let's let the nations truly be the nations. Now, bilateral ecclesiology was adopted explicitly by Hashivenu, MJTI, the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. Its substance was instrumental in the formulation of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations defining Messianic Judaism statement, and also its statement of faith, even though the term bilateral ecclesiology is not used at all in those UMJC documents. Initially, the response to Hashivenu and to bilateral ecclesiology in the Messianic Jewish movement was not particularly positive. Think that's an understatement? Now, I want to be honest with you. Some of that was because of us. I mean, some of that was because of the way we acted as exponents of it. But it was a bold new vision, and it evoked a great deal of controversy and discussion. And what happened in those first years, right after 2000, in many ways is a continuation of one of the greatest weaknesses of the Messianic Jewish movement from its founding, which was this tendency to fragment, to make more with one another, and to have broken relationships with one another. I could give you a list, and Rabbi Rich could as well, that go back to the very beginnings in the 1970s. A truly honest history of our movement would be a history of splits. Now, I think things are starting to change in our movement. And this, to me, is a sign of hope. Because after the initial burst of controversy, what happened was many leaders began to say, we have to find venues to meet together and to talk out these kinds of issues. And what emerged were a set of venues that hadn't existed before in order to process these kinds of questions, where the main leaders across the entire spectrum of the Messianic Jewish movement come together and talk and argue and build relationships and trust. And that's been happening for the last 10 years. And it shows. Now, I think this is especially significant in terms of the message of bilateral ecclesiology. Because what you need to understand about bilateral ecclesiology fundamentally is it's a message of shalom. It's a message of reconciliation. And if we can't find ways to embody that in our own relationships with one another as Jewish disciples of Yeshua, then what good's our message? And this new generation of leaders that is coming along and which will receive the baton from us baby boomers, I think understands this even better than we did. And so this is a point for me of truly being encouraged and hopeful about the future of the Messianic Jewish movement. And about the future of bilateral ecclesiology, whether people in the Messianic Jewish movement are willing to use the term or not. Because the fact is that the core values that are expressed in this perspective are ones which are fairly widely shared these days among leaders in the Messianic Jewish movement. Now, I want to just conclude the substantive part of my message here by talking about some of the adaptations and changes that I see in bilateral ecclesiology. These updates. And I'm just introducing something very briefly that we'll be talking about at length over the next couple of days. Now, when I first wrote about bilateral ecclesiology in the nature of Messianic Judaism, and then in my the book, one of the 3 books that are on the book table, called Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism, one of the main concerns that people had was that post-missionary Messianic Judaism meant non-missionary Messianic Judaism. And so there was a lot of discussion about this term. I deliberately wanted to pick something really provocative. I succeeded, obviously. I wanted to pick a term that would immediately raise a question in the mind of a reader. What is this thing that he's talking about? Because everybody thinks they know what Messianic Judaism is, and at that time, and of course it was just an extension of the missions movement. And so post-missionary Messianic Judaism, what is this? And so I very deliberately picked something that would raise questions in people's minds. And I was using the term missionary here in a very particular way. To be honest with you, I was using it in a non-theological way. I was using it in an anthropological way. I was speaking about the missionary as just someone from one culture who goes into another culture and kind of adapts to that culture with the intent of trying to bring some sorts of fundamental changes in the lives of those people. And often in its worst sense, in effect, to try to subtly bring people out of that culture into the culture from which the missionary comes. I was not arguing in any way that we as Messianic Jews have no mission from God, that we are not representatives of Messiah Yeshua in the midst of the Jewish people or in the midst of the church as representatives of Israel. Of course, some people thought that's what I was intending, and I can understand that from what I left unsaid. So I was very pleased when Rabbi Stuart Dauerman published his new book, Converging Destinies. And I would like to recommend it to all of you. In many ways, it is part of the message of these 5 days. Rabbi Stuart is what's called a missiologist. I might be like an ecclesiologist. There's no such thing really, but you could say I was. I'm someone who's very focused on trying to understand the nature of the people of God. Stuart is focused on the mission, the work, the thing that God gives his people to do in the world. And his book, in many ways, begins to expand this notion of bilateral ecclesiology in terms of a kind of bilateral ecclesiology. And it's something that we have to factor in as we're thinking about the future of the Messianic Jewish movement. I wanted to give you my summary of Stuart's book in two simple propositions. And of course, it's a long book and it's complex, and I'm drastically simplifying, and I can't possibly do justice to the richness of Stuart's treatment. However, this will give you a taste. Okay, two propositions. First, both the Jewish people and the Christian church, the church of the nations, have a part in God's work within the world. What Stuart and missiologists call the missio Dei, the mission of God. It's God's work in the world. And then God brings his people into his work. And what's crucial here is to see that it's not a matter of simply the church being part of this mission. The Jewish people, Israel, has a mission from God that's just as important as the churches. So the mission of God is twofold. And what Stuart is arguing in this book is that the destiny of Israel and the destiny of the church in history are on a converging path. They're not two parallel paths, and they're not two lines going away from one another. They are two converging lines. And where they meet is ultimately in the eschaton. So, first of all, both the Jewish people and the church have this mission from God. And the second proposition, our role as Jewish disciples of Yeshua calls us to participate in both missions. And what that means is we are representatives of Messiah Yeshua to the Jewish people. We are also representatives of the Jewish people to the Christian church. And it also means that as those who truly understand and grasp the mission of Israel within the world, we actually see it as bound up with the mission of Yeshua in the world. And we understand Yeshua better because of understanding Israel's mission. And that therefore we are only willing to present Yeshua in the context of Israel's mission in the world, as a part of that mission. Now, this is all rather general, would need to be worked out in great detail. But, and Stuart does a lot of that. But I think what this means is, yes, we have a responsibility to boldly witness to Messiah Yeshua, to be his representatives in the midst of the Jewish people, but that we do so in a way that takes account of his place within Jewish life and in the eschatological destiny of the Jewish people. Yeshua comes ultimately to bring Israel to its appointed heritage. Now, there are a number of other things I have seen over the last number of years that have made me realize that the way I had maybe initially in my own mind thought bilateral ecclesiology would work is probably not the way it's actually going to work out, and that's fine. And as I said, some of those things are the things I would like to share with you more over the next couple of days. But let me give you just one inkling of it. In Rabbi Rich's introduction, he referred to an initiative I'm involved in right now, which is called the Helsinki Consultation on Jewish Continuity in the Body of Messiah. It's a very strange initiative in which I am a co-chair. The other co-chair is a French Jewish Catholic priest and theologian by the name of Antoine Levy. He was actually here in August at Ruach. Some of you had a chance to meet him. And Father Antoine is a Catholic priest, and he's not intending to leave the Catholic Church, but he's got a very strong sense of his own Jewish identity, and he believes that Jews who are Catholics should be living as Jews, and that the Catholic Church has to find a way to make it possible for them to do so. And we have other Catholics involved with us who have the same position. We have those from the Orthodox Church who are Jews who hold that position. We have those who are Protestants involved in Protestant churches who hold these views. In effect, they're like Jewish Christians in that they have no problem with that term Christian. They are Jewish Christians. But for them, being Jewish is very important, and they're not willing to have it be this little subordinate thing that they do on the side. And they believe that God has done something in the Messianic Jewish movement that they greatly respect, and that they, in effect, think they need. They think that we've pioneered something through the developing of institutions that they can benefit from, that they can learn from, that they can draw upon. In the process of having my mind blown through relationships with these people, I've also realized that they have some things that we could learn from and benefit from. And also that this opens up some new avenues for these relationships of reconciliation and shalom to be worked out very differently than, again, anything I might have anticipated. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that in the coming days. But for me, bilateral ecclesiology is something that's still fundamental. I just think that what it means, what it really means in practice, is something that we have to have an openness to the work of God in our midst, to how it is realized, how it is developed. And we need to understand it in relationship to its core values, what it's fundamentally trying to accomplish. Now, in conclusion, what I'm going to do in each of these presentations, many of you, those of you who've heard my teaching before, you know that usually what I do is exegesis of Scripture. And these are different. What I'm doing over these 5 lectures is not that. But I can't not do something with Scripture. And so what I want to do is end each session with just a reflection on a passage. And the passages are all going to be from Acts of the Apostles, in part because it's a book that I've been working on, a book that I think is of tremendous importance for us as Messianic Jews. And so on this theme of bilateral ecclesiology, I want us to just read, and I'll just make a couple of comments on Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council. So, Acts 15, starting in verse 12. Of course, you all know the circumstance. You know a number of Gentiles have come to believe in Yeshua, and the question is, what do we do with these people? What do we do with them? And there are a whole number of Jewish believers in the community in Yeshua that are saying, circumcise them and let them keep the Torah, and they become proselytes. That's the obvious thing to do with them. And of course, Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, he's taking a very different position to this. They say, no, we need to give them a freedom to develop in new directions. And there are some fundamentals about our life that, yes, they have to take on, but then we have to give them room. And so after this discussion, James, the very seriously observant leader of the Jerusalem community, stands up and he gives the final word. And this is what he says. So, the whole assembly kept silence and listened to Barnabas and Paul as they told of all the signs and wonders that God had done through them among the Gentiles. After they had finished speaking, James replied, "My brothers, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first looked favorably on the Gentiles to take from among them, from among the Gentiles, a people for his name." Now, just linger over that phrase a bit. To take from among them a people for his name. The people there is not Israel. It's not the church understood as like the entire body of Messiah. The people there that's being referred to is that which is being taken from among the nations to be joined to Israel, which is a people. In effect, it becomes these like two peoples, a two-peopled people. A people for his name. Israel is a people for God's name. That's what Israel is. Israel is the people upon whom God's name has been called, who are now called by God's name, who are joined up with God, such that God can be called the God of Israel, such that God cannot be talked about ultimately apart from Israel. That's what it means that God's name is bound up with his people. But here we have a people being taken from the nations that are also for his name. And then he gives some biblical support. This agrees with the words of the prophets, as it is written, "After this I will return, and I will rebuild the dwelling of David, which has fallen. From its ruins I will rebuild it, and I will set it up." This is a reference to the Davidic dynasty, but it's really a reference to the Jewish people as a whole. That what the Jewish people had been lacking in had been their monarch, their king, their ruler. In setting up Yeshua and raising him from the dead and establishing him, God was restoring, rebuilding the house of David, the tent of David. That was James, that was Peter, that was the Jerusalem community. This sign of the presence of Yeshua in the midst of the people of Israel. "From its ruins I will rebuild it, and I will set it up so that all other peoples," and that's probably not the best translation, "the remnant of human beings may seek the Lord. Even all the Gentiles over whom my name has been called." You hear, there's this clear sense of the duality here. Israel's calling, and this people from the nations who are being joined to Israel, while also maintaining their own distinction. "Thus says the Lord, who has been making these things known from long ago. Therefore," James says, "I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, But we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. For in every city for generations past, Moses has had those who proclaim him, for he has been read aloud every Sabbath in the synagogues. These particular practices are practices that come from Leviticus chapter 16 and 17 and 18, and they are practices that in those chapters in Leviticus speak about what the strangers who dwell in the midst of Israel are supposed to do. The idea is God is taking a people from among the nations, and they are now in a metaphorical way dwelling in the midst of Israel. And what we see is they have a particular set of practices that are required from them, but they are not expected to take on all aspects of the Torah. If they did, they would no longer be from the nations. They would basically be absorbed into the life of the Jewish people. And the whole purpose of here is that God might take a people from the nations. Again, that we might have something unique in the world. This people that are called by the name of the God of Israel, but are reflecting all of the nations of the world at the same time. All the diversity of languages and of cultures bound up now to the God of Israel. And each one with the gems that God has planted in their midst, now polished and renewed and given as offerings to the God of Israel. This is really the picture of bilateral ecclesiology, and I think it's fundamentally the vision that should animate us as Messianic Jews in the coming generation. Okay, we have a bit of time here for some comments or questions and answers, and you've heard a little bit now of what Mark Kinser's been thinking about. You can share a bit about what you've been thinking about. And now, some people in sessions like this are pretty strict about everything having to be a question. And I'm not quite that way. I would like to recommend that no one give a sermon. But if you basically want to say something rather than ask something, that's fine. Okay, I'm gonna point. I know it's rude to point, but I'm gonna point anyways. And we have a microphone, and so please wait until the microphone comes to you, and then speak into it. So let's come around it.
Thank you so much. So could you expand a bit about some of these dialogue partners with the Helsinki initiative, about what exactly Jewish Catholic life could look like, or in any of these different denominational type settings? Because this is something new as well for me to hear, and I'm wondering what does that look like in the long term?
Right, yes, and to some extent they don't know. But there are some interesting places one could look for some answers. One of the places would be in Israel, and to look at the Hebrew-speaking Catholic community in Jerusalem. And I find this really to be quite fascinating. And once I got to know them a bit, now whenever I'm in Jerusalem, I'm always sure to go to Mass once at this community. I don't take communion whenever I'm in a Catholic context because I'm not Catholic. But I find fascinating that they've translated the Mass into Hebrew, and they didn't just translate it in a very literal wooden way. They actually adapted phrases from Jewish traditional Jewish liturgy, and idioms and brachot, basically. They because of the Israeli calendar, they meet primarily on Shabbat. Most of their masses are on Shabbat rather than on Sundays. And they, and Father David Neuhaus, who is the priest who's been responsible for it, he's an Israeli who is fluent in Hebrew, and an Israeli citizen from, a Jew from who made Aliyah from South Africa. And Father David was very strong on thinking that, that there's something about Shabbat that is of tremendous importance and that the whole church needs to learn something about. So for him, the fact that that they're meeting on Shabbat is not just a concession to the way the secular state of Israel is run. It's actually something he thinks that's important that they're doing as Jews. At one point, they were studying. They did some study of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council standards of observance. At one point, they were talking together, how are we going to observe Shabbat? And so I gave them our standards, and they studied it together as a group. The point is, it's like they're taking this stuff seriously, and some among them are actually somewhat more halakhically observant. Some are not. But it's a kind of experiment in the land where for the first time you've got this very small Catholic minority of Jews living in the midst of a Jewish state. It's extraordinary. It's so, and when we get together in the Helsinki context, we'll usually have I'll lead a Shabbat service, and the Catholics will lead a mass, a Hebrew mass, that we all attend, even though we don't all partake of. And then there's a Russian Jew who's in the Orthodox Church, but who's a monk, who leads a Messianic Orthodox Vespers service. It's all kind of strange. It's strange. Who knows? They don't know. But what they're looking for is the freedom to do the kind of exploration that our leaders were doing in the 70s, and then who knows how it'll go. But the point is, they're taking this stuff seriously. They're not just thinking they want to be called Jews or something, but just continue to live in every respect as they've always been done. So let's come around this way. I saw some other hands up back here. Who's got the mic? Oh, we've got two. Oh, okay. In the second row here.
Thank you, Dr. Rabbi Mark Kinser.
Mark is okay.
You're the only Dr. Rabbi I know, and it feels good to say it. So
it's a bit of a mouthful.
So two things are on my mind. The first is that because of everything you've said, the question that I think probably all of us have asked at one point and are asking tonight is with that distinctiveness in the one body of Messiah, how does that look? How does it play out? Because there is that distinctiveness which we want to preserve, but yet, as we see, God is beyond, he's beyond what we think.
Yeah.
And so he does what he does, right? And so just a little short little snippet. How does it play out? We have a little havra. We don't have a Messianic synagogue, where we are. But we meet in a church, and the pastor has actually got a Jewish grandfather. And so he has attended our Rosh Hashanah dinner and celebration, and very good rapport there. But also distant. He's just like, yeah, you can have the space, no problem, no charge. Really a blessing, to have a public space like that. So we're, Jacob, my son, he's saying, well, you really want to bless them. How can we bless them? And so God put it on our hearts to pray and to go to their prayer service. We go to the prayer service, which is a total blessing for everyone. And then one night, we're having our little Havra meeting, And he and his wife popped their heads in and say, hey, we just wanted to say hi. You know, we have this event going on, and how's it going? And we said, oh, you know, we were just praying for you tonight. We just felt to pray for you tonight 3 times. And he said, wow, we're the people that were the main people with this event tonight, which is the whole community coming out, were sick and couldn't play their part. And then all of a sudden they felt better. And they just said, let's go. And right while we were praying. And he was so encouraged that we later found out that he, in every single Sunday service, he told that happened. So do you see how God...
Yes.
God is just, he just does what he does.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what? What?
Yeah.
What? You have something.
Yes, I'm, in terms of this notion of mutual blessing and difference, and, you know, one of the things that I do think our own congregation has drawn a conclusion about, you know, has to do with the importance of, we call it Zichron Mashiach, the remembrance meal, the Lord's Supper, whatever you want to call it, and its importance as the place of manifestation of unity and reconciliation. That it's not the Saturday morning, and for us as a congregation, we don't do it on a Saturday morning as part of a synagogue service. We decided at a certain point it was a little odd for us to have a synagogue service that we want to be this wide open thing that we want all Jews to be present at and participate as fully as they can, and then do this odd ritual, which basically is meant to be just for followers of Yeshua, you know. And so we do celebrate the Lord's table in the context of a Saturday evening meal together. That's separate from our Shabbat service. But at that context, we've unlike at a synagogue service, while I think it's wonderful to have to show hospitality, to have Christian friends come and experience it, they're fundamentally coming as guests, you know, to learn and to experience something that's from a different, another tradition. The Lord's table is different. Everybody, no matter what the liturgy is, we're all on exactly that same level at the Lord's table. And so what we've started to do is invite groups from churches to come and partake with us. We meet every month, once a month for this, and then maybe every 2 or 3 times, every 2 or 3 months, we have a group of Christian friends who are, and we feel much more complete. We feel like this is what this event is supposed to be about, and I think for us to be able to partake with them in their communion services is also that it would be good if there were some environments where we could do that, where it was understood we were doing that as Messianic Jews. We weren't part of their church, but we were doing it as the sign of that. In some ways, what the body of Messiah is fundamentally is a table fellowship between Jews and Gentiles. And in Galatians 2, the fundamental issue was, will Jews and Gentiles sit at table together? And so I think finding ways to celebrate the Lord's table together is very important, but also finding ways more broadly probably to have table fellowship together as Messianic Jews and Christians. And I think there's lots of different ways that can happen. And so we have to find ways to do it, to make it concrete and real. So. Thank you.
Is it permitted to ask a question?
Sure.
The question has to do with verse 21 of Acts 15.
Yeah. Yes.
I have heard many times. You know where I'm headed.
I know where you're headed, yes.
How do you...
Okay, let me ask your question for you to see if I get it right.
Yeah.
And then I'll do my best to answer it. The question is that I'm clairvoyant, and I'm reading in your mind. The question is that there are some people who teach that what this means is the Torah is taught in synagogues everywhere. The Gentiles have this opportunity. They will go, and this is all we're requiring as a kind of minimal standard right now. But of course, they will go and they'll learn the rest, and it's expected that they'll grow into Judaism as a whole. I got it right, yeah. I think that what that misses, again, is the way these four practices that James is ruling about are rooted in those texts of Leviticus, in Leviticus 17 and 18 in particular. And what I think James is saying is, anyone who knows the Torah knows that these are the practices that God has always ordained for Gentiles who are going to live in the midst of Israel. And so what he's saying is, well, in every city, Moses, the Torah is read, and therefore Leviticus 17 and 18 have read. And so I'm not really giving you anything dramatically new here. That's not saying, oh, and of course then they'll really get past these elementary things into the whole Torah. And I think ultimately that just becomes another kind of almost imperialistic kind of trying to get the whole church to be Jewish. To make it's again this vision that what Messianic Judaism is like the restored church, and that's ultimately what we're. And I think that's just we're missing the boat if that's the vision that animates us as a Messianic Jewish movement. Sure. Okay, in the back row.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming all the way from Michigan to join us. It's Dr. Rabbi Mark.
No, let's get this clear. It's either doctor, or it's rabbi, or it's Mr., or it's Mark. one of those four.
I was one of the founders of this temple about 20 years ago, and I kind of got away from it the last 10 years. And I've been going to church, the Protestant church mostly, a little bit of the Catholic church. I'm no man's land there, too, because I can't decide whether to be Protestant or Catholic. I don't like either one of them. They belong back here, where my real roots are, and my other fellow Jewish believers, and that's really where I belong. I wanted to say something about Daystar Television. They're very pro-Jewish, very pro-Israel, and they're on national television all around the world. And they talk about the Jewish people as being in our heart, and Israel as being in our heart, and the heart for the nations. And they're broadcasting to 1 billion people. They're all in every country of the world, in every state in this country. And I think a lot of Catholic and Protestant followers are become very pro-Jewish in the last few years because of Daystar. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I don't know how many people here watch Daystar Television, but I really feel like my home is here at Ruach. I respect Rabbi Nathan and Rabbi Rich, and it's a good thing that they do here. I like to see them do an Our Father occasionally. It'll make it a little bit more Catholic, but it doesn't have to be all Jewish. And I like to see more Gentiles come to the church too, and welcome, because they're interested in Judaism, just like we're interested in Catholicism. Rabbi Rich, you have something you want to say?
Great. Okay, coming around this way. Yes. Sure. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Kinzer, thank you so much for your presentation. One thing that I'm very curious about is Chavurot.
Yes.
You spoke a lot about the Messianic congregation and the foundations of it and this bilateral ecclesiology term. What do you think the role of the Chavurot are? I know some people in the movement, like Dr. Dowerman, are very much into finding these kinds of Chavurot. So what's your 2 cents about the Chavurah?
Yeah, yes. I'm going to be speaking at greater length on this in the final session, and in which I'm going to talk about models of Messianic Jewish community life, and because I do think that we need to be open to some new directions here, and I share Rabbi Dowerman's perspective about Chavurot. But I think rather than saying a lot more about it, I'm going to hold off until the final session where, again, I'm going to set it in a broader context of synagogue, Chavurah, and some other models as well that are not often talked about, but that I think we need to consider. So, yeah, we'll just stay in the back there and then work towards the front.
Bilateral ecclesiology lived out, is that more like an interfaith friendship or an interfaith marriage? Like how much working together is it?
Yes.
And does it depend on if it's in a congregation or?
Right. I think the idea in terms of, the fundamental idea is that on an individual or family level, you're primarily rooted in one or the other. It's not a question of like, you're each person being part of two things in that way. The idea is you're rooted in one of these communities or in another one of these communities. And then it's the responsibility of the community itself, as a community, to find ways to have its life tied in together with the life of the other. At the same time, what's also true is that really all of us outside of our participation in a congregation are in all kinds of relationships with people, you know, who are either Jews or Christians or Messianic Jews. I mean, we're in all and so in terms of our daily life, we are we live this out and express it in a host of different ways. But the fundamental perspective of bilateral ecclesiology is to try to say that we need to have these two types of environments that each have the freedom to develop in their own way, such that you don't have to always be this multinational environment of the church doesn't have to always be looking over its shoulder, you know, and to be sure that it's keeping kosher and, you know, doing and observing Shabbat and everything. And in the same way, the Messianic Jewish congregation isn't always overly sensitized to, you know, to having to satisfy the non-Jews that happen to be in its midst. That the Gentiles in the context of a Messianic Jewish congregation understand this is a Jewish congregation, and Jews who are living in the midst of the church realize this is a church, you know, and each of them is willing to serve within that context. And if they feel called to it, then it means that they're subordinating some aspect of their own identity in the midst of it. And so that's the primary thing. So it's actually a way of trying to bring greater clarity, actually, and simplification, rather than to try to get everybody into this sense where every individual is in this relationship with every other either Gentile Christian if we're a Jew, or a Messianic Jew if they're a Gentile Christian. Yes, coming to the front.
Yes, may I call you bilateral ecclesiologist, Mark? So, Mark, you mentioned earlier how the Messianic Jewish congregations developed by deciding or discovering that they needed to reclaim the Jewish calendar and Hamoadim, by rediscovering Torah as an enduring foundation of Jewish life and finding new meaning in Jewish life and rabbinic tradition. And I was wondering if you would add to that list history. Because when you gave the history of Messianic Judaism, that little sketch, it was phenomenal. You know, it was really great to encapsulate that. So I'm wondering, how would you bring history, both Jewish history from the days of Acts to present, as well as Christian history, as well as world history? Is that all part of? this discussion.
It is all part of this discussion. And it's a very helpful comment and question, because to have a corporate identity is to have a memory. You know, memory is fundamental to, of course, memory for us as individuals, your own individual identity is shaped by your own memories. And in the same way, the identity of any corporate reality, like the United States of America, you know, it's shaped by a history and a memory of a particular history. The way we tell that history of, you know, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Second World War, et cetera, the Civil Rights Movement, et cetera. You know, what we are as Americans is rooted in that particular history. And so that is true for the church, and that is true for the Jewish people. Now, it's one of the weaknesses of Americans is we have a rather superficial approach to history, and even though we, you know, even to have a national identity, we have to have some elementary sense of a past. Our orientation is almost always to the future, you know, other cultures are different, but Jewish culture is very different, and I think that it's a weakness of American Christian culture. That it does not have a deep sense of its own history. I think that part of what bilateral ecclesiology means is that we have to have a sense of our identity as Jews and the whole flow of Jewish history, which is our history. It's not someone else's history. It's not the history of, like, the Jewish people over there. You know, it's the Hashemino core values, probably the key one says, the Jewish people are us, not them. You know, that means this history is our history, not their history. And with the Christian church, it's a little different, because the Christian church has been fundamentally, for the last 17, 18 centuries, the church of the nations, rather than the church of the circumcision, you know, and this bilateral ecclesia that we can see in the New Testament does not actually get expressed much. Only the one side, that side which was the people that came out from the nations in Acts 15, is what is manifested historically, and so even there. Now, I think that the tendency for Messianic Jews is therefore to say that history is a terrible history, and we don't want anything to do with it, you know. And so, but I think that's not right. But it's also, I think, not right for us to simply say it's our history. I think that this, if you understand bilateral ecclesiology, what we're saying is this church of the nations is our partner. It's like a marriage partner. And that means its history is something that is linked to us, that we do have a relationship with, but that we're not called to simply identify with it totally as ours either. It's a more complicated relationship with the church, the history of the church. But that what we have to affirm is that the church needs its history. And if what we end up is, if we're simply become those who are assaulting the church and its history, and then what we're really doing is also undermining the capacity of our partner to have an identity itself that has anything positive about it. And so, you know, this is complicated, but I think bilateral ecclesiology helps us in this regard, because it allows us to have that balance where we can respect and we can appreciate and we can affirm without having to simply say it's us in the same way in which the church would say it's us. But for the Jewish history, even though this is a history of Jews who didn't believe in Yeshua by and large, we really can simply say it's us. So that's why I think it's a really, really good question. Maybe I think what we will do is this will be our Oh, we have two. Okay, we'll take these last two, and then we'll draw to a close.
Hi, Rabbi Mark. Maybe you plan to talk about this later on, but I'm just wondering how, when you said bilateral ecclesiology has evolved in ways that you did not anticipate. I'm wondering if you could maybe share a little bit of that. And also, I wanted to ask from a personal point of view, what role, how should the possibility of conversion be a component in that whole
Yes. Again, I am going to put it off because both of those questions I'm going to be taking up in tomorrow morning in discussing this question of the new Jewish landscape. Also, I'll take it up a bit tomorrow afternoon with the new Christian landscape. So, particularly the conversion issue, I'm going to talk about a bit more in detail.
Hello, thank you for speaking. It's a pleasure. I'm going to ask a cyclical, simple question, so bear with me. But I don't think I'm understanding you. It's about the Jerusalem Council. So if the list that they presented was actually supposed to be a list that is required for Gentiles to keep, and not something that they're supposed to add on as they learn in the synagogues from the Torah, then how can you explain that there aren't really a lot of laws there that are expected for Gentiles to keep, like honoring your father and mother, do not covet? Even, I mean, the two greatest commandments are not even in that list. There's like nothing there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what we're getting here are fundamentally what you might call the ritual commandments that are required. It's presuming for sure, what you might call like the Noachic commandments. I don't particularly think Noachic that it was formulated. The notion of Noachic commandments was formulated already in the first century. But there's something about a fundamental sense that there was a covenant that God made with all human beings, which we see in the text in Noah. So that the after the flood, that's where you get the commandment of not to kill, because human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. And so there it's a mitzvah which is given to all human beings. So that's presumed. And what you find within the Torah as a whole, in fact, there is a certain kind of fundamental code of moral conduct which is presumed to apply just as much to the nations as it does to Israel. Not because the nations are living under the Torah, but because there was something fundamental in the covenant that God made with all human beings that requires those things. What is being added here is something more, because when Gentiles were not simply living out there, but were living in here in the midst of Israel, they needed to do more than just keep the fundamental moral commandments. There were some aspects that, again, you might think of that are like dietary laws and laws that have to do that are ritual laws that relate to sexuality, that might not be required upon them if they were not bound to Israel in the same way. And so I think what's being said here is that by virtue of being joined to Israel, there really are some new requirements that go beyond simply what God is asking of every human being, which is by virtue of being a human being. But that it's not, what's not required of them is everything that's found within the Torah as a whole. That's why these things are singled out in particular, as I see it. So, okay, well, I don't know, Rabbi Rich, if you want to officially draw us to a close here.
Well, Rabbi Mark, thank you so much for such a stimulating and helpful discussion. Let's say thank you to our friend who has been such a blessing. I just want to make just a couple of quick comments. Just something that came to mind in terms of this bilateral idea and how it expresses itself on the ground in reality, not just in our heads. This building that we're in, this lovely building, is the product of a church and a Messianic Jewish synagogue joining together, pooling resources, because we covenantally needed Friday night and Saturday. They needed Sunday. It's been a match made in heaven. It's all paid off. What could be bad, you know? And it has worked just magnificently. So I just suggest that as one of 100 creative ways that the distinction of Israel and the nations could be maintained, but the love and unity of a bilateral approach to ecclesiology to life can be very, very rewarding. Okay, we are done, and so I'm going to ask Shana, could you give us a final word about anything relating tomorrow morning, time, anything at all? 9:30, that's it. 9:30 a.m., let's try and begin promptly, and thank you all so much for coming. Many of you from faraway places, we're honored by your presence. Have a wonderful evening. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 9:30. Shalom.